Defense, your turn.
May it please the court?
Yes, sir.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Nouman Raja, it is my pleasure to give the defense opening statement. And I ask you to pay the same close attention to my statement as you paid to the state's. This is a terribly sad and tragic case. It's an example of a perfect storm that turned deadly when Corey Jones pointed a loaded handgun at Nouman Raja. But Mr. Jones's death was not the result of any criminal act committed by Nouman Raja. It was a perfect storm that turned deadly when Mr. Jones pointed that handgun and Mr. Raja, in defending himself, fired his handgun. Mr. Jones pointed the handgun at Mr. Raja not once, but twice. And each time Mr. Raja fired, he was acting to defend himself against the threat posed by Corey Jones. It was a perfect storm that tragically resulted in the death of one man and another man's nightmare. The fact that Corey Jones is dead is undeniably sad and tragic. Another man, Nouman Raja, is being prosecuted for crimes that he's not guilty of. And to convict him would be sad and tragic. Because the evidence will show that Mr. Raja was lawfully and justifiably defending himself after Mr. Jones pointed a loaded handgun at him. The state made a very powerful opening statement, much of it based upon emotion. We're going to lay out the facts of the case, which is what you need to determine your verdict in this case. The judge will tell you that emotion should not play a part in your verdict. Facts should. Now, we're going to spend the next 2 weeks discussing an incident that occurred in seconds. You're going to hear the audio tape from the ATT call center, which encapsulates how long this incident occurred, but we're going to be spending 2 weeks going over in minute detail what occurred in seconds. And here's what happened in those few brief seconds. On October 18, 2015, Corey Jones pointed a loaded handgun at Nouman Raja. I've shown all of these exhibits to the state, Your Honor.
Okay.
This, ladies and gentlemen, is a photograph of the handgun that Mr. Jones bought several days before this incident. The photograph was taken by Sheriff's Office investigators after the incident was over. This is another photograph taken of the muzzle of the gun, also taken by crime scene photography. And the reason I'm showing you this is because this area around the barrel of the gun is going to become extremely important when you get all of the copies. Here's another different view of the firearm. Small firearm, silver in color. And what the state buried late into their opening statement is the most important part of this case. You'll remember that the state told you that in an effort to try to determine whether or not Mr. Raja could have seen the gun that Corey Jones had, that they went out to try to see whether or not that was possible. Let's not gloss over that part of the case. This photograph that I'm showing you and the next several photographs that I'm going to show you were done several weeks, 2 weeks after this incident occurred. What happened was, the morning this incident occurred, Mr. Raja gave a voluntary cooperative statement to investigators. You're going to see the entire what's called a video walkthrough of the incident. And when he gave that video walkthrough, he told the investigators that he saw something very specific when Corey Jones pointed the firearm at him. He said that he saw a red flickering light around the barrel of the handgun when Mr. Jones pointed it at him. Now, in an effort to determine whether or not that was possible, Sheriff's Office investigators went out to the scene at 1:30 in the morning, a couple of weeks afterwards, and conducted what you're going to hear referred to as a light reflectivity test. And the light reflectivity test was done by an investigator from the state attorney's office, depicted in this photograph right here, standing in the approximate position where Corey Jones was, and a videographer and photographer from the sheriff's office standing where Mr. Raja was at the time of the incident, and took photographs and video as the investigator held the handgun in his hand and moved it around. This photograph and the next several photographs that I'm going to show to you prove that the light reflectivity test demonstrates that Mr. Raja saw the handgun that Mr. Jones pointed at him. Why? This is a diagram. Let's see. I'll go into it in a little bit more detail. This is PJ Boulevard. This is the southbound off-ramp off of I-95. This is where Mr. Raja's vehicle ended up. This is Mr. Jones' vehicle. Now, when the investigators went out to do the light reflectivity test, they stood in the general position where the two participants were. Behind Mr. Jones, Mr. Raja, and behind the videographer, there are traffic lights. Traffic lights at the intersection of the off-ramp and PJ Boulevard, which are red and green. These photographs, all of these photographs were taken at the same time. And you will also see a video of that. And you'll see, as the investigator moves the firearm around, the red light glints off of the barrel. Now, how does this show that Nouman Raja was telling the truth. Because this firearm is what's called the Jimenez Arms 380. Shows you the photograph. Mr. Raja said, I saw a red flickering light, like a laser max. He used the specific words, laser max. A laser max. He is familiar with firearms. He was a firearms instructor at Palm Beach State College. A laser max is a specific type of laser, not the kind of a laser like you might see in the movies that goes from the barrel of the gun out to a point in the distance. But a laser max is the type of laser that has a flickering around the barrel. And when Mr. Raja described the flickering around the barrel, it is exactly what the investigators duplicated when they went out 2 weeks later. Mr. Raja was very specific about what he saw, and the photographs and the video prove that. I'm going to show you all the photographs because they're taken in sequence. This, ladies and gentlemen, this photograph right here is what Mr. Raja saw when Mr. Jones pointed the firearm at him. The other photographs basically show the same thing. Red light glinting off of the barrel, just like a laser gun. Here's a photograph which shows the green light glinting off the barrel, because the traffic lights are behind Mr. Raja and the videographer. Another photograph demonstrating the same thing. And another photograph demonstrating the same thing. Now, when they discovered Mr. Jones's firearm, and I'll show you where it was located, it did not have a laser max on the end of the barrel. It didn't. Why is that significant? Because from the time that this shooting occurred until the time that Mr. Raja gave his statement, he had no opportunity whatsoever to see the firearm that had been located by the police. No opportunity to make up anything at all about the firearm. He saw what he saw, and the photographs perfectly replicate what he saw. Let's go back to the diagram of the scene. Once again, this vehicle right here demonstrates where Mr. Raja's vehicle was, or where Mr. Jones's vehicle was. And we'll get into a little bit later. These 3 yellow markers represent where cartridge casings from Mr. Raja's gun were found. And these 3, 4, 5, and 6 demonstrate 3 other casings where Mr. Raja's casings were found. Other parts of this diagram will be explained in a little bit more detail. When Mr. Raja got out of his van and approached Mr. Jones had the gun in his hand and pointed the gun at Mr. Raja and held that gun in his hand from this point where his car is all the way to this point where the gun was found in the ground, on the ground, next to a signpost. Mr. Jones held that gun in his hand that entire time. He was a threat the entire time that he had the gun in his hand. He had already pointed it at Officer Raja, and he still had the ability to fire that gun because he had it in his hand. Now, as the state told you, three of the bullets struck Mr. Jones, one in the left arm, one in the right arm, and one on the side of the chest, underneath the right nipple. And through this case, you're going to hear about certain aspects of the fields of ballistics and forensic pathology, which is medical examiners, autopsies, human factors, and psychology. One of the things that the state mentioned repeatedly in their opening statement was that Mr. Raja lied about what happened. Well, we talked in jury selection about what can possibly affect memory. Stress, a highly stressful situation. And what you're going to hear is that in the field of the study of human factors, experts agree that in highly stressful situations, such as when police officers are confronted with life and death situations and discharge their weapons, the stress of the incident can impact how they perceive and relate the incident. They don't always get everything right. Time and space get distorted. And it's not anything that the officer purposely does, not intentionally being deceptive. It's a result of the stress of the incident. As I indicated, we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about an incident that occurred in just seconds. And on the one hand, this case is very simple. On the other hand, it's very complicated. It's very simple in that there will be no doubt at the end of this case that Corey Jones pointed a loaded handgun at Mr. Raja. But what will take time, and what makes it somewhat complicated, is it's going to take time to accurately describe how everything occurred. And that's what's going to take time. So this 2-week period is really going to be talking about just a very short period of time. But we have to remember, it was a very, very short period of time. Being a police officer is one of the most dangerous jobs there is. When Mr. Raja went out to work, he didn't know whether he was coming back. They don't. Police officers don't know. Because the time that they're on a shift is when anything can happen, and oftentimes does. Things can occur in a split second. And a split second can mean the difference between life and death for an officer. An officer has to be vigilant and be able to quickly respond to any situation, including a threat to his own life. And second-guessing and Monday morning quarterbacking is not real life. What's real life is what happens on the street. Let's talk about what led up to this incident. Nouman Raja joined the Palm Beach Gardens Police Department in April of 2015. He'd been an officer with the Atlantis Police Department prior to that time. And he was also, as I said, a firearms instructor at the Palm Beach State College Police Academy. He was assigned to the patrol division of the Palm Beach Gardens Police Department. And sometimes what happens is officers in the patrol division, their job is to travel around in their zones and patrol and see whether or not anything is happening, what they can do, if there are crimes occurring, respond to them. But there are also specialized details that the department sets up. And in this particular case, a detail was set up called the auto burglary detail. And Mr. Raja was assigned to the auto burglary detail. And the assignment was to travel throughout parts of the city that was really hit hard by auto burglaries. And they would set up decoy cars. Decoy cars, and if they saw somebody who was trying to break into a vehicle or the decoy car, then they would be able to respond to it. But because they didn't want the police officers to be recognized, they would put them in unmarked vans and in plain clothes. And that's how Mr. Raja was dressed that evening. The assignment was to travel throughout the city without being spotted as a police officer and blowing his cover. So he started his shift at 7 o'clock on October 17th, 2015. He was initially dressed in uniform. He went on a domestic call earlier in his shift, and then he went back to the station, and then he changed into the plainclothes clothing that the officers were using in this auto burglary detail. Jeans, a t-shirt. And officers routinely carry 2 firearms when they're on duty. The department issued firearm and their own personal firearm. And Officer Raja did that. He had a department issued firearm and his own personal firearm, which was approved for use by the department. He also had a bulletproof vest, which is ordinarily worn, most of them are ordinarily worn underneath the uniform, but this particular one was one that went over. But it wasn't a department supplied vest, it was one that Mr. Raja had to purchase himself, not provided by the department. So when Officer Raja got into the van, he was dressed in plain clothes. There was the vest, there was a radio, his department issued handgun next to him in the front seat. Not wearing it so as to not draw attention to the fact that he was a police officer. He had his department approved handgun in a waistband holster. Also in the back of the van were riot shields, which he was to carry around in the back of the van in the event that anybody needed riot shields. And let me explain to you what that means. There was going to be a hip-hop party at a club called Lux in Palm Beach Gardens. And if police needed quick access to riot shields to help in a disturbance, possibly, then Mr. Raja was the one who had the riot shields in the back of his van. After he had been on patrol for a few hours, the police dispatcher radioed that there was a disturbance at the Marriott Hotel and that officers were to respond to the scene. Mr. Raja headed in the direction of the Marriott so that he could be close by in the event that the riot shields were needed. And as he drove east on PGA, approaching I-95, he saw off to his left what appeared to be an abandoned vehicle on the side off the off-ramp. The hood was down. The doors were closed. There were no hazard flashing lights. It was also close to the DoubleTree Hotel, which is on the other side of this swale area here. You'll see photographs of it. And a parking lot which was packed with cars. So for all intents and purposes, it looked like this vehicle was abandoned. Hood down, no flashing lights. Officer Raja thought to himself, oh, let me check this out, because I'm on auto burglary detail. There are burglaries occurring all throughout the city. Let me go and get the tag number on that vehicle in the event that there's a burglary reported in the parking lot of the DoubleTree Hotel, and I can then see whether or not that vehicle was involved. So officers let dispatchers and their supervisors know where they're going and what they're doing, so everybody can be accounted for. Even plainclothes officers, as I indicated, may be needed to respond to an incident if necessary. Officer Raja, you'll hear this, notified dispatch and his supervisor, Sergeant Anderson, that he was going to check out that vehicle on the off-ramp. And Sergeant Anderson responded with 10-4, which means acknowledged, understood. So Officer Raja, now authorized to check out the vehicle, made a U-turn on PGA just east of I-95 and started to drive toward the off-ramp. There was no other traffic on the road at the time. rather than get on 985 to go north, and have to go up to an exit, and then come back and get off the exit, wasting time, valuable time, he decided that he was going to go up, because there was no traffic, go up the north side, the north on southbound lanes on this side of this little triangle here. Median dividing the left turning lanes from the east turning lanes on PGA. And he pulled his van where he did and the way he did, because otherwise he would have had to have made a 3-point turn. So he came around this way and he pulled his van up this way so he could get and park it and pull it in front rather than make a 3-point turn. And what happened was, as soon as he pulled up close to this abandoned vehicle, couldn't see anybody in the vehicle. Couldn't see anybody. But as he got closer to the SUV, suddenly and surprisingly, that driver door opened and somebody got out. Officer Raja stopped his van and threw it into park. He now has a potentially dangerous situation on his hands. Why is that? Because he is now sitting in a stationary vehicle. There's someone outside. He has no idea who that person is, what that person is doing. And if he stays in the vehicle, stuck with someone outside, he's in what is called the fatal funnel. The fatal funnel. It's a term well known in law enforcement. It means that if he stays in the vehicle, he's a sitting duck. He's got nowhere to go, no way to protect himself. The person outside can be anywhere in the wide part of the funnel and have the ability to shoot. Police officers have to be vigilant about this. So it's imperative that he get out of the vehicle. He has to do it very, very quickly. The vest is next to him, but he can't put the vest on, because in order to put the vest on, he'd have to turn, put the vest on, put it on over his head, and he would then be blinded and not be able to see what that person was doing on the outside of his van. So he doesn't do that. He can't do that. He puts himself in danger if he does that. So he gets out and he starts to walk around the front of the van. Now, the state says that Officer Raja did not identify himself. But that is not what the evidence will be. As you've been told, there is audio of this incident. It's being recorded by AT&T Roadside Assistance. You'll recall that Mr. Jones was on the phone with AT&T Roadside Assistance. They're based in Tennessee. Mr. Jones's phone is on one end, and the AT&T call center is in Tennessee. And so they're recording and listening to what is happening through Mr. Jones's phone. And you'll see, after this incident was over, you'll see that Mr. Jones's phone is found on the floorboard in between the seat and the front door, left driver's door of his vehicle. And so his phone is recording what's going on his end. But the phone is in the SUV, closest to him. And when Mr. Jones opened up the door of his SUV, when that door is open, if the key is in the ignition, you'll hear a pinging sound. Ding, 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 and that's what you'll hear. And because Mr. Jones is close to his phone, Mr. Jones's voice is clearly heard. And Officer Raja is still some distance away, around the front of his van. The phone cannot pick up clearly what is being said by Officer Raja when he is close to the front of his van. The recording of his voice is more faint. But you hear the recording, and you're going to hear an enhanced version of the recording. And you're going to hear from an audio expert at the very beginning of the recording. There is a human voice that can be identified as saying something. And as a matter of fact, you're going to be provided with a transcript of that call, which shows that a voice was heard right after the pinging sound is heard. And there are only 3 possibilities as to who that voice belonged to. It wasn't Mr. Jones. It wasn't the AT&T call center. It was Mr. Raja. And he starts the conversation, "Police, can I help you?" The first word that Corey Jones utters is, "Huh?" You'll hear it. "Huh?" Like, what? I didn't hear you? It's a question mark. It's in response to something that Officer Raja said. Officer Raja speaks. It's faint, but it's there. And it's faint because the phone is on the floorboard right next to Mr. Jones, closer to Mr. Jones. Because Mr. Raja was further away from the phone, the phone didn't pick up clearly what was said, but you clearly are going to be able to hear that there's a human voice, and the transcript is going to reflect that there was a human voice. Now, you're also going to hear later on, after the shooting, still on the AT&T recording, after the shooting takes place, Mr. Raja walks backward down the off-ramp, back down to his vehicle. Remember, Mr. Jones's phone is still on the floorboard. The recording of the AT&T roadside assistant call can be synced up with the 911 call because at this point in time, Officer Raja is now on 911. So you can place those 2 recordings together, sync them up, run them together, and what you'll hear that as Mr. Raja approaches the phone, you can hear him both on the AT&T recording and the 911 call, but as he moves back towards his van, you no longer can hear him. And that's why the AT&T recording did not pick up clearly what was said by Mr. Raja when he was both at the front of the van when he first saw Mr. Jones and as he came back after the shooting had occurred. Now, back to the conversation between Mr. Raja and Mr. Jones. Mr. Raja says, "You okay?" Mr. Jones responds, "No, I'm good. Yeah, I'm good." Now, Mr. Raja has his personal firearm on a holster belt. He doesn't have it drawn. Corey Jones starts to back away and raises his arm with his gun in his hand and points the gun at Mr. Raja. Everything changes at that point. Everything changes. Because now, Officer Raja's life is in danger. He specifically sees the red flickering light around the barrel of the gun. Like I said, it looks just like a laser. You didn't make it up. You'll see it. After the shooting occurred, he was instructed to go back to his van. And he walked backwards down the ramp to his van. He doesn't want to turn his back on the darkness because he doesn't know if there's a still active shooter there. And as he passed by down the off-ramp, he doesn't see the gun that Mr. Jones had in his hand from the time that he got out of his car until the time that it's dropped near the sign which I'll show you right here. The gun is found. Mr. Jones's gun is found in the spot right where it says 7. Mr. Jones had the gun in his hand the entire time. From here, his door, to where it was found. Now, when Mr. Raja cooperated with the investigators and told them what had happened and told them about this red flickering light, he described what happened. And he had every right to defend himself. Like I said, this is where everything changed. This is a tense and rapidly evolving situation. This situation goes from, it's just a car broken down, to I'm going to die if I don't do something, if I don't defend myself. So he did pull his gun out, and he shot at Mr. Jones, who had been pointing a firearm at him. He shot 3 times. He thought that he might have struck him, but he's not sure. Mr. Jones starts running, the gun in his hand, from his vehicle in this direction, towards that sign. And then when he gets to the sign, he turns around and points the firearm at Mr. Raja again. And that's when Mr. Raja fires the second 3 shots. Mr. Raja says that he then sees Mr. Jones drop. And he sees something silver fall, but he's not sure what it is. Just that it's silver. Mr. Jones then runs into the darkness. Mr. Raja can't see him. He yells into the darkness to drop the gun. Why does he do that? Why does he tell him to drop the gun? Because it's entirely reasonable, and you'll hear this, that it's entirely reasonable to assume that if a person has 1 gun, they have 2. It's called the 1+ rule. He can't assume that Mr. Jones only has 1 gun. And you're going to hear, ladies and gentlemen, from the evidence that when officers began to arrive and they approached Mr. Jones's body, they too were concerned that there might be another gun. After the last shot is fired, Mr. Raja calls 911. Now, he thought that he had called 911 before the last 3 shots were fired, but he was wrong. He was mistaken. He wasn't lying, wasn't trying to make up and conjure something up in 30 seconds. He was simply wrong. It's not uncommon. He tells dispatch he fired shots. He can't see the suspect. An alert tone goes out. It's an emergency high priority call, which all officers hear, and the police department quickly goes into action, and they respond to the scene. The scene gets locked down because they don't know where this person is. If the suspect is still there and hiding or running away, they want to make sure that they catch him. And so they secure the scene. So several sergeants, the supervisors on duty, they take control of the scene. Nobody really knows where this person is. Several sergeants decide to get what they call a ballistics shield to search for the suspect. A ballistic shield is a piece of equipment that officers can get behind if they're afraid that there's a firearm or weapon out there and someone could possibly use it. So they get behind it for protection. So a team of sergeants and Mr. Raja, they carefully and cautiously begin to move up the ramp into the darkness. Someone then sees a body laying in the grass. And as the ballistic team approaches the body, Other officers have their guns trained for the same reason that I just described. They have to make sure that this person is not armed. And when they get to Mr. Jones's body, he is lying face down with his hands underneath. His hands can't be seen. And it's possible and needs to be assumed that there's a firearm. They can't take the chance. Just can't take the chance. So Mr. Raja is directed to turn Mr. Jones over very, very slowly, which he does. They're on high alert in the event a gun is found. When Mr. Jones's body is lifted and turned over, there is no firearm. But they had to be on alert for that. And that's why they were armed and had the ballistic shield. Mr. Raja is in order to go back to his van and wait for more supervisors to arrive. Now, at that time in Palm Beach County, the Palm Beach Gardens Police Department and the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office had an agreement that the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office would investigate any officer-involved shootings in Palm Beach Gardens. So one department's not investigating them themselves. So the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office was called, and their investigators and crime scene technicians go out to the scene. Assignments are given. People are interviewed. The hotel was right next door. So investigators try to find out who the guests were in the hotel. Maybe they heard something. Well, it just turns out that that day, that night, there was a convention, a conference of pastors, chaplains from fire departments and police stations, police departments around the country and parts of Canada that was holding a conference there. So it was full. So investigators go and try to find everybody that they can who's still there, who hasn't left yet, and they try to interview them. Because some people had left, the sheriff's office asked the FBI in the local regional offices, Oklahoma, Oregon, Canada, to interview witnesses. So that's what happens. Now, as we discussed, several hours after the incident, the PBSO investigators asked Mr. Raja if he would provide a statement describing what happened. And he agreed. He cooperated with the investigation. There was no talk of any wrongdoing or anything at that time. You'll see the entire tape statement that he gave. And there are times during that videotape walkthrough when he becomes very emotional. You'll see it. He realizes that he has just taken someone's life and that he could have been killed. And in that statement, he describes what I have just described to you. That he saw the vehicle on the side of the road, that he approached it, he saw the door suddenly open, he saw someone get out, he walked around the front, he spoke with Mr. Jones, Mr. Jones pointed a gun at him, he sees the red flickering light around the barrel and feared for his life, knowing that he had to defend himself, and fired his gun at the person who was pointing the gun at him. He saw the person go north, saw the person turn and point the gun at him again, fired again, lost sight of that person. And in his statement, he is asked to place himself where he was when he fired. Now, the state made a point of saying that where he placed himself is false. What you'll see when you watch the video is that the investigators asked Mr. Raja where were you? Tell us where you think you were when you fired the first 3 shots. Now remember, he's already gone through this highly stressful incident. He had a gun pointed at him. And he does the best that he can. And he places cones on one side of the door. And it turns out that's not where he was. Why do we know that's not where he was? Because when the firearm that he was using discharges, the casings are ejected to the right and back. To the right and back. And so when casings, there are 3 casings that are found in this vicinity here, near the back of Mr. Jones's vehicle, and 3 casings that are found a little bit further up the ramp. And when the casings hit the pavement, they can bounce, but you can get a general idea of where the person who did the firing, did the shooting was when the shooting took place by the placement of the casing, a general idea. So he's mistaken as to where he was when he fired the first 3, understandably so. He's more accurate when he discusses where he was when the second 3 shots were fired. He's also, as I said, mistaken about when he called 911. He thought he called 911 prior to firing the second 3 shots, but it's clear that he didn't. And the state harps on their theory that he was lying about this. There's no reason for him to lie about it. He saw what he saw, and he did what he had to do. Unfortunate, and as sad and tragic as it is, he did. Because moments before, he had just looked down the barrel of a gun. Now, we discussed how people can get it wrong after being in a stressful situation. You're going to hear something called perceptual distortion. Perceptual distortion. It's a very common consequence of being in a very extremely stressful, life-threatening situation. It's particularly common in officer-involved shootings. Time and space get distorted. People experience tunnel vision. They don't hear things, like your own gun going off. Mr. Raja will say, I didn't even hear my own gun going off. How is that possible? It's because of what happens in the extremely stressful situation. It's so common, you'll hear about it. Doesn't know how many shots he fired. It affects someone's ability to accurately perceive and recall events. And it is not, as the state suggests, intentional deception on Mr. Raja's part. Now, you've heard reference to crime scene investigators. I just want you to understand that that's what they're called, crime scene. Just because they go to a scene and they're called crime scene investigators, it doesn't mean a crime was committed. That's just what they're called, the crime scene unit. Now, this is a photograph of the scene taken later, in the daytime hours. And you can see this is the rear end of Mr. Jones's vehicle, here. And you'll see a photograph of a little placard there called 1. That's near where 1 casing was found in the first 3. And then you see 4, 5, and 6, where the other casings were found. And based upon their general location, you can get approximate location of where Mr. Raja was when he fired these 6 shots. When Mr. Raja fired from this from here, from this position here, roughly here, Mr. Jones was at roughly this, somewhere along here, on this line right here, somewhere between where Mr. Raja was and where this sign is, where the gun was found. Somewhere in that vicinity. And it just so happens, carry that line out, there's a palm tree. A palm tree is just off the pavement. And that palm tree is right in line with the first set of shots. And there's a mark in that pine tree, consistent with the bullet striking it. There's a pine tree in this area. you look at the photograph, you can see that the pine tree is up in this vicinity here. There's a real white shed, and it's up in this vicinity here. And from where Mr. Raja was when he fired the second set of shots, and Mr. Jones was here, because he says he saw Mr. Jones fall, and he saw something fall, silver fall. The trajectory from this second set of shots to this pine tree also lines up. And they do, in fact, find the bullet hole in the pine tree. And they find the bullet in the pine tree from Mr. Raja's gun. The last piece that I want to talk to you about is about forensic pathology. You heard the prosecutor talk about medical examiners, and they do autopsies and they try to determine the manner and cause of death and what people can do. Well, we used to call them coroners. They're now called medical examiners, but they're MDs. And in this case, the autopsy was done by an associate medical examiner in the Palm Beach County Medical Examiner's Office named Gertrude Just. So she did the autopsy and she took photographs and she measured. She did measurements and she collected bodily fluids. She did everything a medical examiner is supposed to do, and she prepared a report. She described the injuries to Mr. Jones' body and the exit points, the entry points of each of the wounds and the exit points. The bullets that cause the arm wounds, they're called perforating wounds. You'll hear this phrase used, perforating. And that means that there's both an entry wound and an exit wound. So for the arm wounds, you'll see entry wound and exit wound. The injury to the torso, it's right underneath the right breast. And that's what's called a penetrating wound, because in this particular case, a penetrating wound is one that enters the body but doesn't exit, because the bullet is found up near Mr. Jones's shoulder. And that wound was the fatal wound. It struck Mr. Jones here, ended up in the left shoulder, and it struck the heart, and it hit the aorta and the pulmonary artery, and it caused severe damage. And the trajectory after it impacted Mr. Jones, as described by Dr. Just, was right to left, front to back, and slightly upward. That's going to become very significant when you listen to the testimony of the medical examiners. And what it means is that in order for Mr. Jones to have received that shot, he had to have either been facing or turned slightly left of Officer Raja. His right arm also had to be out of the way. It couldn't have been here, next to his chest, in order for that chest wound to have been received. Otherwise, it would have hit the arm. His arm had to be up in order for that to have happened. Dr. Just characterized the cause of death as a gunshot wound to the torso, and she characterized the manner of death as homicide. And when you hear her talk about that, I want you to understand that just because she calls the death of Corey Jones a homicide, that doesn't mean a crime was committed. It is medical examiner terminology to describe a death as a result of an encounter with another person. Because causes of death can include homicide, suicide, accidental, like a car accident, or natural as a result of disease. Medical examiners can also tell us what happens after people receive injuries like this. They can tell us what a person can and can't do after receiving an injury like this. And in every aspect of life, some medical examiners are better than others. Some are more qualified than others. And you're going to hear from a medical examiner who's more qualified and more competent than Dr. Just. And he's going to tell you that the wound to Mr. Jones's chest, heart, did not necessarily cause him to drop where he was shot. It may be difficult to believe, but you're going to hear it straight from a highly qualified medical examiner. As a matter of fact, all the medical literature, all of it, for decades and decades and decades, tell medical examiners that Dr. Jus is wrong. Because the state wants you to believe that Mr. Jones was shot from the second three shot, somewhere up in this vicinity here, near the tree. This is where his body is located. They're going to suggest to you that the shot that killed him, Mr. Jones, was somewhere up in this vicinity. And the reason is because Dr. Jus, who's wrong about this, says that in order, when the shot is received, when he gets that shot, he can't travel very far. So they're stuck with Dr. Jus, who says that the fatal shot, Mr. Jones had to have been somewhere here, in this vicinity here, close to where his body was located. Why is that important? Well, it's important because it's very, very unlikely that that's where Mr. Jones was when he received the fatal wound. You'll hear it from the medical experts. The evidence will show that it's much more likely that he received that wound in the first round of shots, right after he pointed the firearm at Mr. Raja. Nobody's going to be able to tell you exactly where Mr. Jones was when he received the wounds to his arms. It just can't be. Now, I want to just... The state told you that they want you to find Mr. Raja guilty of manslaughter by culpable negligence. And they read what they believe the judge is going to read to you about culpable negligence.
2 minutes, counsel.
Thank you very much. And they read part of the instruction to you. And they said to you that this instruction right here, when you listen to the facts, is going to convince you that Mr. Raja is guilty of manslaughter by culpable negligence. What they forgot, or didn't forget, to read to you is this. The judge will tell you that the negligent act or omission must have been committed with an utter disregard for the safety of others. Culpable negligence is consciously doing an act or following a course of conduct that the defendant must have known or reasonably should have known was likely to cause death or great bodily injury. And what they're going to suggest to you is that getting out of the vehicle and walking up to Mr. Jones and talking to Mr. Jones, all of those are so reckless that it was likely that Mr. Jones was going to die as a result of those things that Mr. Raja did. And that is simply not true. So as the evidence unfolds in this case, all we ask you to do is to keep an open mind. The oath that you took is to base your decision only on the evidence, and there's been a lot of press coverage, and you're not paying any attention to that. It has nothing to do with this case. We just ask you to follow the facts and the law and listen to all the evidence. And we believe that when you hear all of the evidence and the law is provided by Judge Marks, that you will find the defendant not guilty. Thank you very much for your time and attention.